Imagine you're running for your life. The wind doesn't just howl, it screams your name. Every gust feels like a claw, trying to tear your children from your grasp. Now imagine the man chasing you. The one whose voice is a blade in that wind is the same man who once promised to protect you. This was Moselle Staval's reality, and the blizzard tearing through the Montana wilderness was the least of her problems. Behind her, his boots crunched through the ice, a rhythm of pure rage. He was getting closer. She could feel it. "Run faster," she screamed to her eldest Clem. "Don't you dare look back." Clem, only a boy, was already a man. He dragged his little sister Essie through snow that came up to her waist. Moselle clutched their youngest, Nelwyn, to her chest, the child's whimpers lost in the storm. Then came the voice, twisted, unforgiving. "You think you can survive without me, Moselle?" Delmare Huxley's words cut deeper than the cold. "You're nothing. You're all nothing without me." He wasn't just drunk this time. He was something else, something broken and furious. Moselle knew what he wanted. It wasn't just to bring them back. It was to finish what he'd started, to erase them. Through tears that froze on her cheeks, she saw it. A light, faint, golden. A cabin tucked between two giant pines, like a prayer answered in the middle of a nightmare. Hope, hot and fierce, surged through her. It was a long shot. It was their only shot. "Clem, the door! Knock!" The boy, exhausted and terrified, threw himself at the heavy wooden door. His small fist pounded against it, a desperate drumbeat against the storm's fury. Essie slipped on the icy porch steps, a silent cry escaping her blue lips. Behind them, the crunching stopped. He was here. The door swung open. A man filled the frame. He was a mountain, tall, broad-shouldered, with a beard flecked with silver and eyes that had seen 1,000 winters, just like this one. He didn't move. He just looked. At Moselle, at her terrified children, and then past them into the swirling white. Delmare stood just at the edge of the clearing. The rifle in his hand suddenly looked like a toy. He stared at the man in the doorway, and for the first time all night, Delmare Huxley looked afraid. Something unspoken passed between them. A warning, a challenge. Without a single word, Delmare lowered his rifle, turned, and vanished back into the blizzard. The mountain of a man stepped aside. His voice was like rocks grinding together. "Get in." What would you do if the one person who could save you looked just as dangerous as the monster you were running from? The warmth of the cabin was a physical blow. It hit them so hard Moselle stumbled, her knees nearly buckling. A pot of something simmered over a massive stone hearth, filling the air with the smell of stew and safety. The children huddled together, their small bodies shaking uncontrollably. The man moved with a quiet purpose, his huge frame surprisingly graceful. He pulled heavy wooden chairs closer to the fire, not speaking, just acting. "Sit," he commanded. It wasn't a request. Moselle obeyed, her fingers so numb she could barely peel the frozen coats from her children. Clem, ever the protector, helped his sister Essie. Little Nelwyn, silent with shock, buried her face in her mother's lap, refusing to let go. The man disappeared into a back room. He returned with thick wool blankets that smelled of pine needles and wood smoke. He wrapped them around the children, his large calloused hands surprisingly gentle. Then he poured a steaming, dark liquid into 3 chipped mugs. "Drink," he said, handing one to Clem. "It's broth. It'll warm you from the inside." Moselle took a mug for herself, her whole body trembling as she wrapped her hands around it. The heat was a miracle. She watched their host as he moved about the small, clean space. He checked the door, sliding a heavy wooden bar into place. He added another log to the fire, sending a shower of sparks up the chimney. Everything about him screamed solitude, the way he never quite met their eyes, the way the silence seemed to be his natural habitat. He was a man who had built walls around himself, and they had just crashed right through them. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice raw and broken. He just grunted, not looking at her. He stirred the fire with an iron poker, his face illuminated by the dancing flames. The silence stretched, thick and heavy. Moselle thought he might not speak again. "You come far?" he finally asked, his back still to them. Moselle hesitated, but there was something about his steady presence, the fact that he hadn't demanded answers, that made her want to give them. 3 days, she said, her voice barely audible. From Osby Creek. She glanced at the children, now dozing in the overwhelming warmth of the fire. She didn't need to say the rest. She didn't need to talk about the empty cupboards, the promises that turned to fists. The night he came home with whiskey on his breath and hell in his eyes. The man nodded once. He understood. He didn't need the details. After another long pause, he turned from the fire. For the first time, he looked directly at her. His eyes weren't cruel. They were just empty, like a landscape that had been burned clean. Name's Burl, he said. He paused as if weighing his next words. Burl Stovall. Moselle's heart stopped. For a split second, the world tilted on its axis. The roaring fire, the howling wind, the sleeping children, it all faded away. There was only that name, Stovall. Her name, her real name. The name of her first husband, the kind, gentle man who had died 5 years ago, leaving her a widow before Delmare Huxley had slithered into her life with his sweet words and empty promises. It couldn't be a coincidence. Not here. Not in the middle of nowhere. She stared at him, her mind racing. Was he a relative? A cousin she'd never met? Her late husband, Samuel, had spoken of a brother. An older brother who'd had a falling out with their father and headed west years ago. Never to be heard from again. But that was impossible. Moselle, she managed to say, her voice shaking. And these are Clem, Essie, and Nelwyn. Burl's stoic face didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes as he looked at the children. A deep, ancient sadness. He looked at Clem, whose face, even in sleep, was a perfect echo of Samuel's. You're safe here, he said, his voice softer now. Storm's not going anywhere tonight. Neither are you. Relief, sharp and overwhelming, washed over her, but it was tangled with 1,000 new questions. Who was this man? Why did Delmar, a man who feared nothing, run from him? And what did it mean that the man who had just saved them shared the name of the man she had lost? She wanted to ask. She needed to know. But looking at his closed-off face, she knew it wasn't the time. So she just met his gaze and whispered it again. Thank you. Burl turned back to the fire, his broad shoulders creating a shield between her family and the raging storm. Outside, the blizzard battered the cabin walls, but inside, surrounded by secrets and the ghost of a name, Moselle and her children were finally, terrifyingly safe. Morning arrived not with a sunrise, but with a slow, gray softening of the world. The blizzard had exhausted itself, leaving behind a deep, muffling silence. Moselle woke first, her body a single, unified ache from sleeping in the chair. The children were still asleep, bundled in the wool blankets, their faces flushed and peaceful for the first time in days. The fire had been stoked, a low, steady flame pulsing in the hearth. Burl was gone. A knot of anxiety tightened in her stomach. Had he left? Had he decided they were too much trouble? She found him outside. He was splitting wood with a powerful, practiced rhythm, the axe rising and falling in a perfect, deadly arc. Snow dusted his shoulders, but he seemed as much a part of the frozen landscape as the pine trees themselves. You don't have to do that for us, she said, her voice quiet in the vast stillness. Burl didn't stop. The axe split a log with a sharp crack. Not for you, he grunted, his breath pluming in the frigid air. For the stove. Stove's got to eat. Same as us. Moselle almost smiled. She knew this kind of man, the kind who hid his heart behind a wall of gruff words and hard work. Her Samuel had been a softer version of that man. This one was all sharp edges and granite. Without asking, she walked over and began gathering the split logs, her arms protesting. She stacked them carefully on the porch, her movements slow but steady. Burl stopped swinging the axe. He watched her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. Could have stayed inside, he said. Been sitting too long, Moselle replied, not looking at him. Feels good to move. He just nodded once, a silent acknowledgement, and went back to his work. They fell into a rhythm, the sharp crack of the axe and the soft thud of wood on the pile. No words passed between them, but something did, a shared understanding. They were two people who knew how to endure. When they went back inside, the children were awake. Clem stood by the single window, a small, watchful sentinel. Essie was trying to comb Nelwyn's tangled hair with her fingers. Burl poured coffee into 2 tin cups. It was black, bitter, and scalding hot. He handed one to Moselle. "Weather's breaking," he said, staring out the window. "Roads will be impassable for another few days. Then you can move on." It wasn't a question. It was a statement. "You can't stay here." Moselle's heart sank. I don't know where we'll go. I thought I had family in Palm County, but the letters stopped coming months ago." Burl didn't press for details. He just sipped his coffee, his gaze distant. "Ain't the first person to come through these mountains looking for something that ain't there anymore," he said quietly. "Sometimes all you find is more of what you were running from." The words hung in the air, heavy with unspoken history. His history. The days that followed were strange. They were filled with a quiet routine that felt both temporary and deeply rooted. Burl was a man of few words, but he was a man of constant action, and the children, drawn by his quiet strength, began to orbit him. Clem followed him like a shadow, watching with wide eyes as Burl checked his trap lines, cleaned his rifle, and read the clouds like a book. Burl never explicitly taught the boy, but he never sent him away either. He just let him watch, and Clem absorbed it all. Essie, who was shy and retiring, found her courage with Moselle, helping to cook the simple meals of salted meat and dried beans. But her eyes would often follow Burl, a flicker of curiosity in their depths. And then there was Nelwyn. Too young to understand fear, she was the one who finally broke through his walls. She would trail after him as he worked, her tiny footsteps falling in his massive ones. "Why do you live alone?" she asked one afternoon, her high piping voice echoing in the quiet cabin. Burl, who was mending a leather strap, froze. Moselle held her breath. He didn't look up from his work. "It's quieter this way," he said, his voice flat. "Don't you get lonely?" Nelwyn pressed. He pulled the stitch tight. "Loneliness is a choice." Later that day, Moselle saw him sitting by the fire, whittling a small piece of wood. His large hands, which could split a log with a single blow, moved with surprising delicacy. As she watched, the shape of a small fox began to emerge from the wood. It was exquisitely detailed, its head cocked as if listening for a sound only it could hear. It was a toy, a child's toy. "You carve well," she said softly, stepping closer. Burl started, as if caught doing something he shouldn't. He almost hid the small fox in his hand. "Keeps the hands busy," he muttered, his eyes on the fire. "Who is it for?" she asked, her heart beating a little faster. He was silent for a long time. The only sound was the crackling of the logs. "No one," he finally said, his voice thick with a sorrow so profound it made the air in the cabin feel heavy. "It's for no one." He placed the little fox on the stone mantelpiece, next to a faded photograph of a woman and a young boy that Moselle hadn't noticed before. The woman was smiling, her eyes full of light. The boy, who couldn't have been older than Clem, was holding a nearly identical carved fox. Burl's wife and son. He hadn't chosen loneliness. It had been forced upon him. The emptiness in his eyes suddenly made a terrible kind of sense. This cabin wasn't a fortress he had built to keep the world out. It was a tomb, a memorial to a life that had been stolen from him. Moselle looked at her own children, sleeping soundly by the fire. She looked at this broken man, surrounded by ghosts, and she finally understood the look on Delmare's face when he'd seen Burl in the doorway. Delmare hadn't seen a stranger. He'd seen a man with absolutely nothing left to lose, and that was the most dangerous kind of man in the world. The revelation of Burl's past changed something in the cabin. The silence was no longer empty. It was filled with shared, unspoken grief. Moselle found herself watching him, not with fear or curiosity, but with a deep, aching empathy. She knew what it was to lose a husband, but to lose a child, that was a pain she couldn't fathom. She stopped talking about leaving. Burl stopped mentioning it. They existed in a strange limbo, a temporary family forged in a storm, suspended between a violent past and an uncertain future. One evening after the children were asleep, Moselle was mending Clem's torn shirt by the firelight. Burl sat across from her, cleaning his rifle, the rhythmic click and slide of the mechanism a familiar, almost comforting sound. "You should tell me to go," she said suddenly, not looking up from her sewing. Burl stopped what he was doing. "Why would I do that? We're a burden. We're eating your food, taking up your space. And Delmare, he'll be back. You know he will. He's not the kind of man who lets go." "Let him come," Burl said, his voice a low growl. The rifle clicked back into place. "He'll bring trouble," she insisted, finally looking at him. "He might bring the law. He has papers. He told me he does." "Some papers ain't worth the ink on 'em," Burl said, his eyes dark. "And some laws ain't worth following." He leaned forward slightly. "He hurt you. He hurt those children. I saw it on your faces the second you fell through my door." "He did," she whispered, the admission costing her more than he could ever know. "Then this is where you stay," he said. It was not a suggestion. It was a declaration. A dangerous hope began to flicker in Moselle's chest, a hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel in years. But it was tangled with that one nagging question. The name, Stovall. She had to know. "Burl," she began, her voice trembling slightly. "My husband, my first husband. His name was Samuel Stovall." Burl went perfectly still. The rifle lay forgotten across his lap. He stared at her, and for the first time, the empty landscape of his eyes was filled with a raging storm. "Samuel?" he breathed, the name a ghost on his lips. "Little Sammy." Moselle's heart hammered against her ribs. "You knew him?" "Knew him?" Burl's voice cracked. He slowly stood up, his towering frame seeming to fill the entire cabin. He walked to the mantelpiece and picked up the faded photograph of the woman and child. He ran a thumb over the boy's smiling face. "Samuel was my brother," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears. "My baby brother." The world spun. Moselle gripped the arms of her chair to keep from falling. His brother. She had stumbled through a blizzard, running from a monster, and landed on the doorstep of the only family she had left in the world. I didn't know," she stammered. "He told me his brother went west, that you'd had a fight with your father." "I did," Burl said, his back to her. "A terrible one. I was young and stupid and proud. I walked away and never looked back. For years I told myself I'd go back someday. Make things right." He turned, his face a mask of agony. "By the time I swallowed my pride, it was too late. I got a letter from a neighbor. Said the fever had taken my parents, and that Samuel had married a girl from Osby Creek and was doing well." He looked at her, his eyes boring into hers. "The letter said his wife's name was Moselle. You knew who I was?" "I had a hunch," he admitted. "The name. The way Clem looks just like him." He swallowed hard. "I sent a letter back. To Samuel. It came back a year later. Unopened. Returned to sender. Deceased." The words hung in the air, heavy and cold. I thought you were all gone," he whispered. "The letter didn't mention children. I figured the fever got you too. Or you'd moved on. I never even knew he had a family." He looked at the sleeping children, his face crumbling. His family. Moselle stood and crossed the room, her legs unsteady. She stopped in front of him, closer than she had ever dared to be. She could see the tears tracking paths through the grime on his cheeks. "He would have been so proud of them," she said softly. "He would have been proud of you," Burl corrected, his voice choked with emotion. "To keep them safe from a man like that." The walls between them, built of grief and solitude and secrets, finally came crashing down. This wasn't a stranger's cabin anymore. This wasn't a temporary shelter. It was home. In that moment, Moselle felt a flicker of something she thought had died with Samuel. The feeling of being protected, of being part of something bigger than herself. But that's the thing about hope. It's brightest right before the darkness closes in again. And the darkness, in the form of Delmare Huxley, was already on its way back. This time he wasn't coming alone, and he wasn't coming to talk. The fragile peace they had found was shattered a week later. It came not with a shout, but with the distant sound of horses, too many horses. Burl heard them first. He was outside teaching Clem how to set a snare, when his head snapped up. He stared out at the tree line, his body instantly rigid. "Clem," he said, his voice deadly calm. Go inside. Tell your mother to bar the door and stay away from the windows." The boy didn't ask questions. He just ran. Mosel's blood ran cold when Clem burst through the door, his face pale. She didn't hesitate. She slammed the heavy wooden bar into place just as Burl came in behind them, his rifle in his hand. "How many?" she asked, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "4," he said, checking the load in his rifle. "One of them is Sheriff Tate." Of course, Delmare had brought the law, the corrupt, pocket-lining law of the county. Moselle felt the floor drop out from under her. They were trapped. They had no rights, no one to appeal to. Burl was just a squatter in the eyes of the law, and she was a runaway wife. They watched through a small crack in the shutters as the riders came into the clearing. Delmare sat on his horse, a smug, triumphant look on his face. Beside him, Sheriff Tate looked bored and impatient. The other two men were strangers, hard-faced men with guns strapped to their hips. Hired muscle. "Moselle!" Delmare's voice boomed across the clearing. "I know you're in there. I've come to take my children home, like I promised." He made it sound so reasonable, so paternal. Moselle felt a wave of nausea. Burl stepped onto the porch, his rifle held loosely at his side. He looked massive, immovable, a rock against which Delmare's tide would break. "They are home," Burl called out, his voice echoing in the still air. Delmare's smile was a thin, cruel line. "Now let's not make this difficult, Stovall. The sheriff here has the papers, all legal and proper. Custody signed and sealed by the judge himself. I'm within my rights." Sheriff Tate, with a theatrical sigh, unrolled a piece of yellowed paper. "By order of the Circuit Court of Hyampom County," he read in a monotone drone, "Moselle Stovall is hereby ordered to relinquish custody of the children Clem, Essie, and Nelwyn to their legal father, Delmare Huxley. Failure to comply will result in your arrest." It was a death sentence. Moselle knew it. Going back with Delmare was a death sentence. "That's enough," Burl interrupted, his voice low but carrying a terrifying weight. All eyes went to him. "I know what you are, Huxley," Burl said, taking a slow step forward. "You're a coward who left his family for dead in a blizzard. You're a man who thinks people are property." He stopped at the edge of the porch. "But that ends here. Today." Delmare laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "You have no say in this, mountain man. This is family business, and the law is on my side." "Is that so?" Burl said. Suddenly, a new voice cut through the tension. "I wouldn't be so sure about that, Sheriff." Everyone turned. Stepping out from the dense woods behind Delmare was a man Moselle recognized. Old Doc Briggs, the town's physician, and behind him was Pastor Connor and Mrs. Webb from the general store. And then more people. 10, then 20. The townsfolk. They emerged from the trees like ghosts, silent and grim-faced, carrying hunting rifles and farm tools. They formed a wide, silent semicircle behind Delmare and his men. Delmare's jaw dropped. The sheriff looked stunned. "What is this?" the sheriff stammered, his hand hovering near his pistol. Mrs. Webb, a woman whose small frame housed a will of iron, stepped forward. "We stand with her, Sheriff," she said, her voice clear and strong. "We stand with Burl." Pastor Connor nodded. "That woman has raised those children with more grace and courage in the face of this man's cruelty than anyone I've ever seen. This is not justice. It's a kidnapping, sanctioned by a bought and paid for badge." The sheriff paled. He looked from the crowd of determined faces to Delmare, then back to Burl. Delmare's confidence was gone, replaced by a snarl of pure fury. "This isn't your business," he screamed at them, but it was Burl who answered, and his next words changed everything. "It is now," Burl said. He looked past Delmare, his eyes locking with Sheriff Tate's. "And Sheriff, you might want to take a closer look at that court order." The sheriff frowned, confused. "What are you talking about, Stovall?" "Just look at it," Burl insisted. Hesitantly, Sheriff Tate looked down at the paper in his hand. He squinted at the official seal at the bottom, and then his face went white. He looked up at Delmare, his expression a mixture of horror and betrayal. "Delmare, you fool," the sheriff whispered, his voice shaking. "You absolute fool. This seal, it's the wrong one. This is the seal for the old county lines, before the redistricting of '78. A ripple went through the crowd. Doc Briggs stepped forward, pointing a trembling finger at the document. That's not just the old seal. That's a forgery. I'd stake my life on it. The ink is wrong. The press is too shallow. Delmare's face turned ashen. He had been so arrogant, so sure of himself, that he'd used an old forged document, thinking no one in this backwater town would know the difference. He had miscalculated badly. The two hired guns behind him exchanged a look. This wasn't what they'd signed up for. They weren't about to get into a firefight with an entire town over a forged document. Slowly, they began to back their horses away. "This isn't over!" Delmar shrieked, his voice cracking with desperation as he saw it all slipping away. He pointed a shaking finger at Moselle, who now stood in the doorway, her children clustered behind her. "She is my wife. Those are my children." "No," Moselle said, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "We are not yours. Not anymore." For the first time, Clem stepped out from behind his mother. He stood beside Burl, small but unbowed, and stared directly at the man who had terrorized his family. "You're not our father," Clem said, his voice clear and steady. "A father doesn't try to hurt his family." That was the final blow. Defeated, humiliated, and exposed, Delmare stared at the son who had rejected him, the woman who had defied him, and the town that had stood against him. With a bitter curse, he yanked his horse's reins and galloped away, disappearing into the trees. The sheriff, looking utterly defeated, crumpled the forged paper in his fist. Without another word, he and the remaining riders turned and followed, leaving a profound silence in their wake. Moselle looked at the faces of the townspeople, these near strangers who had risked everything for her. She looked at Doc Briggs, at Pastor Connor, at Mrs. Webb. "How did you know?" she whispered to Burl. "How did you get them all here?" Burl finally allowed a small, weary smile to touch his lips. He put a hand on Clem's shoulder. "I didn't," he said, his voice filled with pride. "He did." He explained how, days ago, sensing that a confrontation was coming, he had shown Clem a hidden path through the woods, a path that led directly to the town. He had told the boy, "If you see more than one rider coming, you run. You run as fast as you can, and you tell Doc Briggs that Burl Stovall is calling in a marker." Clem had done exactly that. While Moselle was barring the door, the boy had slipped out the back and run the 3 miles to town, a desperate Paul Revere in miniature. Moselle stared at her son, her heart swelling with a love so fierce it almost brought her to her knees. He wasn't a boy anymore. He was a hero. She looked at Burl, the man who had not only saved them, but had trusted her son to save them too. "A marker?" she asked. Doc Briggs stepped forward, his eyes twinkling. "Years ago, my wife took ill with the winter lung, a storm just like the one you came through. We were trapped. Burl here rode 20 miles in that blizzard to fetch the medicine that saved her life. Never asked for a thing in return." He smiled. "I told him that day, if he ever needed anything, the whole town would answer. Looks like today was the day." The tension finally broke. The townspeople cheered. Mrs. Webb enveloped Moselle in a hug, pressing a loaf of freshly baked bread into her hands. People were clapping Burl and Clem on the back. For the first time in years, Moselle wasn't just surviving, she was living, surrounded by a community, protected by family. As the townsfolk began to disperse, promising to bring supplies and to keep watch, Burl turned to Moselle. The setting sun cast a golden glow over the clearing. "I think," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "that it's time we made this official." "Official?" Moselle asked, confused. "This cabin," he said, gesturing around them. "It's been a memorial for too long. It's time it was a home again. A real home." He took a deep breath, the words coming with difficulty. "Your home, if you'll have it." "Our home," she corrected softly, her eyes shining with tears. She reached out and took his large, calloused hand in hers. It fit perfectly. Later that night, the fire crackled, a cheerful, defiant sound against the quiet of the wilderness. The children slept soundly in a small room Burl had cleared out for them, their dreams finally free of monsters. Moselle and Burl sat at the small table, the silence between them comfortable and deep. "He'll be back," she said, not as a statement of fear, but as a fact. I know, Burl replied. Men like him are like poison ivy. They always grow back. He looked at her, his expression serious. But next time, you won't be facing him alone. We'll be ready. He was right. They weren't running anymore. They were home, and they would defend it. But they had no idea that Delmar's next move wouldn't be with forged papers or hired guns. His revenge would come in the dead of night, silent and deadly, and it would come with fire. The days that followed the confrontation were like a dream. The town embraced them. Mrs. Webb brought quilts and flour. Doc Briggs brought books for the children. And Pastor Connor came by just to sit on the porch and share a cup of coffee with Burl. It was a life Moselle had only ever imagined. The cabin began to change. Moselle planted a small garden with seeds from Mrs. Webb. The scent of baking bread replaced the smell of dust and disuse. The children's laughter echoed in the clearing, a sound Burl had once thought he would never hear again. He taught Clem how to track, how to fish, how to read the forest. He carved a beautiful, delicate bird for Essie and a simple wooden whistle for Nelwyn, who filled the days with her sharp, happy tunes. One evening, as Moselle was tucking Nelwyn into her small bed, the little girl looked up at her with wide, serious eyes. "Is Burl our new pa?" she asked. Moselle's breath caught. She smoothed the hair back from her daughter's forehead. "Would you like that?" she asked softly. Nelwyn nodded enthusiastically. "He's big and strong, and he makes the monsters go away." Later, Moselle found Burl on the porch, staring up at the star-dusted sky. She told him what Nelwyn had said. He didn't speak for a long time, just watched the moon rise over the jagged peaks. "For years," he finally said, his voice low and thick, "this place was just quiet. I thought that was peace, but it wasn't. It was just empty." He turned to look at her, his eyes full of a raw, vulnerable emotion she had never seen before. "You and them, you filled the quiet. I never meant to want you to stay." "I never meant to stay," she admitted, her voice a whisper. He smiled, a true, genuine smile that transformed his rugged face. "Funny how life gives you what you need, right when you've given up looking for it." He reached out, his fingers gently brushing her cheek. "Stay, Moselle. Stay and make this your home. Make us your home." Tears streamed down her face as she leaned into his touch. That was all she needed to hear. It was a new beginning, forged from the ashes of their old lives. But ashes were about to become a terrifying reality. It happened 2 nights later, a moonless, suffocatingly dark night. Moselle was jolted awake by a sound she didn't recognize, a low, hungry crackle. Then came the smell, smoke. She threw open the bedroom door and was met with a wall of heat and blinding orange light. The main room of the cabin was an inferno. Flames licked up the walls, devouring everything in their path. "Burl!" she screamed, her voice choked with smoke. The children were awake, crying in terror. Panic, cold and absolute, seized her. They were trapped. The only way out was through the fire. Suddenly, a massive shape burst through the flames. It was Burl, his face blackened with soot, his shirt smoldering. He was carrying a heavy wood axe. "The back wall!" he roared over the sound of the fire. "It's our only chance." He didn't run for the door, which was already engulfed in a curtain of fire. Instead, he ran to the back of the cabin, to the wall that faced the deep woods. With a primal yell, he swung the axe. The thick logs groaned but held. He swung again, and again, his powerful blows the only thing standing between them and a fiery death. Moselle shielded the children, herding them away from the encroaching flames. The heat was unbearable. The smoke was a poison cloud, stealing the air from their lungs. With a final, desperate heave, Burl shattered a section of the wall. A gaping hole opened up to the cool night air. "Go! Now!" he yelled, pushing Moselle and the children through the opening. They tumbled out onto the damp earth, gasping for air, their eyes streaming. Moselle turned back just in time to see the roof of the cabin collapse inwards, with a deafening roar, sending a geyser of sparks and embers into the night sky. Burl was still inside. "Burl!" she screamed, a sound of pure agony. For a heart-stopping second, there was nothing. Then he staggered out of the wreckage, burned and bleeding, but alive. He collapsed to his knees, coughing. his body racked with pain. They had escaped. They were alive. But their home, the sanctuary they had fought so hard for, was gone. It was nothing but a roaring pyre in the heart of the forest, and they all knew who had done it. From the shadows at the edge of the clearing, a figure stepped forward. Delmare Huxley. He wasn't smiling this time. His face was a mask of insane, triumphant rage. In his hand, he held a lit torch. "I told you!" he hissed, his voice trembling with a terrifying glee. "I told you that you were nothing without me. If I can't have you, then no one can. If I can't have my home, then you can't have one either." Burl struggled to his feet, placing himself between Delmare and his family. He was unarmed, injured, and exhausted. Delmare was fresh, fueled by hatred, and holding the weapon that had just destroyed their world. "This is between you and me, Huxley," Burl growled, his voice a low rumble of pain and fury. "It was always about you," Delmare shrieked, his eyes wild. "She was mine. The children were mine. You took them from me. You and this whole wretched town." He raised the torch, preparing to throw it. But before he could, a new sound cut through the night, the thundering of hooves. Out of the darkness, a dozen riders burst into the clearing. It was the men from the town, led by Sheriff Tate. But this time, the sheriff wasn't bored or corrupt. His face was set in a grim, determined line. He had seen the glow of the fire from town and had known instantly what it meant. Delmare froze, caught in the act, surrounded. There was no escape. No lies or forged papers could save him now. But he wasn't going down alone. With a desperate cry, he lunged not at Burl, but at Moselle, grabbing her and pressing the still-burning torch against her throat. "Stay back!" he screamed at the riders. "Stay back, or I'll burn her too!" Everything stopped. The riders reined in their horses. Burl stood frozen, helpless. Moselle could feel the searing heat of the torch against her skin, the smell of her own hair beginning to singe. In that moment of pure terror, a small figure darted out from behind Burl. It was Clem. In his hand he held the small, sharp, whittling knife Burl had given him. He had been practicing with it for weeks, learning to carve his own small animals from scraps of wood. He didn't hesitate. He didn't make a sound. He ran straight at Delmare's back and drove the small blade with all his might into the back of Delmare's leg. Delmare screamed in pain and shock, his grip on Moselle loosening for just a fraction of a second. It was all the time Burl needed. He launched himself forward, a wounded bear moving with impossible speed. He tackled Delmare, sending them both crashing to the ground. The torch flew from Delmare's hand, landing harmlessly in the dirt. The fight was brutal and short. Burl, driven by a protective fury that transcended his injuries, was an unstoppable force. The townsmen swarmed in, pulling him off Delmare just as the sheriff slapped iron cuffs on the whimpering, defeated man. It was over, truly over. As they dragged Delmare away, he looked back one last time, his eyes filled with a pathetic, final hatred. "You'll never be free of me," he spat. Moselle, holding her children close, looked at him, no longer with fear, but with a kind of pity. "We already are," she said. The sun rose on a scene of devastation. The cabin was a smoking, blackened ruin. Everything they had was gone, but they were alive, and they were together. The townspeople surrounded them, a silent, supportive circle. Mrs. Webb wrapped a blanket around Moselle's shoulders. Doc Briggs was tending to Burl's burns. Burl looked at the wreckage of his old life, the tomb he had lived in for so long. Then he looked at Moselle and Clem and Essie and Nelwyn, his family. "It's just wood," he said, his voice hoarse. "We can rebuild." Clem, standing tall and proud beside him, nodded. "We can build it bigger this time." Moselle looked at her son, then at the man who had become his father in every way that mattered. She looked at the smoldering ashes of their past and saw not an ending, but a new foundation. A foundation built not of wood and stone, but of courage, sacrifice, and a love that had, quite literally, walked through fire. Not every family is born. Some are forged. They are fought for, built from broken pieces, and chosen with every single sunrise. In the end, it's not blood that defines a family. It's who stands with you when the world turns to ash, who builds beside you when all hope seems lost, and who shows you that home isn't a place you find, but something you make together. If you enjoyed this story of courage and the unbreakable bonds of a found family, make sure you hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. We bring you powerful stories of justice and redemption every single week, and you won't want to miss what's coming next.